Nasrallah was a very smart guy. And I will say honestly, I feel the world, I feel the loss. I literally feel the loss of his death. It feels like the world is an emptier place or more vacant place.
Lebanon historically has served as the graveyard of Israeli and US hubris. We saw that in 1982.
Netanyahu wants to pull off a 1967.
The US is now fully on board with the Israeli agenda.
And here there's some disagreement between Mouin and I. I think they succeeded.
Well, that Iranian response is playing out as we speak, with press reports of over 100 ballistic missiles fired from Iran towards Israel. And I think the context is interesting.
Kamala Harris is not even a zero, she's a -1.
Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. This is a very special show today with Professor Norman Finkelstein and Mouin Rabbani. Given the situation in the Middle East, particularly on Israel-Lebanon border, we would like Mouin and Norm to walk us through what's going on. Mouin, if we could start with you to give us an update about what's going on. There is a lot of confusion about whether it's an invasion, whether it's just an air attack. So can we just begin by you giving us an update about what has happened in the last week?
Well, what's happened in the last week is the outcome of what's happened in the last 2 months, which is particularly Israel's successful assassination of the Hezbollah General Secretary, Hassan Nasrallah, and virtually all of Hezbollah's senior military command in a whole series of attacks. And this appears to have given Israel the confidence that it can dismantle Hezbollah. And yesterday, it announced that it had commenced with a ground invasion of Lebanon. According to Hezbollah, no Israeli troops have crossed the border, and Israel's activities remain limited to air and artillery shelling, primarily of southern Lebanon, but also of the southern suburbs of Beirut, of the Bekaa Valley, and other places. I think the key question is to what extent Israel has been able to damage Hezbollah. And yesterday, I think the Deputy General Secretary of Hezbollah, Naim Qassem, laid out criteria by which I think we can judge developments. Basically, in his statement, he maintained that Hezbollah remains institutionally coherent and that it is working to speedily replace its fallen leaders. He maintained that Hezbollah retains its military capabilities and the ability to use them. And he insisted that Hezbollah will not change its objectives, particularly regarding linking the Lebanese arena to the Gaza Strip. This morning, we've had a number of Hezbollah missile attacks on not only northern Israel, but also on Tel Aviv. And separately, we've had U.S. warnings that they have detected signs of an imminent Iranian missile attack on Israel. Whether this is accurate intelligence reflecting reality or a 2003 Iraqi WMD story meant to legitimize a preemptive Israeli attack on Iran remains to be seen. I'd just like to make one last comment, which is that Israel has claimed that its invasion of Lebanon has as its objective to push Hezbollah back north of the Litani River so as to enable the residents of Israel's northern communities who Israel evacuated last October to return to their communities. I don't think that makes much sense because we're not talking about the PLO in 1982 which wouldn't have had the ability to continue reaching Israel from certain points north of the border. We're talking about Hezbollah, which can reach Tel Aviv from the extreme north of Lebanon. And what I think, having mentioned 1982, what I think we're looking at is a much more ambitious Israeli strategy, namely that the assassinations of the past 2 months have given Israel the confidence that it can now dismantle the coalition known as the Axis of Resistance, delinking them from Gaza and dismantling them one by one, with the ultimate objective of seeking a direct U.S.-Iranian military confrontation that could lay the basis for regime change in Iran. And I think the road to Tehran, as far as Israel is concerned, runs through the southern suburbs of Beirut. I think the challenge for Israel, and for the United States for that matter, which I think now is fully on board with Israel's strategy and committed to making it succeed. Their problem is that Lebanon historically has served as the graveyard of Israeli and US hubris. We saw that in 1982 with the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, which was designed to reshape the Middle East, but whose main achievement was the establishment of Hezbollah, which Israel is fighting today in 2024. And we saw in 2006 where then U.S. Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice hailed Israel's invasion of Lebanon in that year as the birth pangs of a new Middle East, which turned out to be a rather messy abortion at the end of the day.
Norm, can we have your response to what Mouin just said?
I can't comment on the military situation because I don't possess the facts or the analytical ability to make sense of it. I would just say that on that point, that the crucial variable was whether or not Hezbollah would continue on the course it had set, which was we're going to target northern Israel and further, unless there is a ceasefire in Gaza. And I wasn't sure whether they would persist in that course or look to the long term and let the Israeli forces into Lebanon and engage in a guerrilla war as they did from 1978 to 2000. In other words, whether Hezbollah was going to adopt a very long-term strategy or it was going to settle some scores right now. I've said all along that the Hezbollah strategy was quite obvious because we've seen it in action, not only in Lebanon, but we also saw it in action in in Gaza with Hamas. And the strategy basically is not to let Israel declare victory. So each time Israel commits its massive atrocities and believes it's now won the war, there is a reaction. And the reaction has always been the firing of the rockets, either from South Lebanon or from Gaza, so as to deny Israel the ability to declare victory. And then it's always left with only one choice. If you want to take out the Hamas or the Hezbollah rocket attacks, you have to invade. And it seems Hezbollah is still set on forcing Israel to carry out a real invasion. What they're doing now is basically a photo op. Same thing as they did in 2006. In 2006, they mobilized the troops. The troops were on the border. They kept saying, we're going to invade, we're going to invade, we're going to invade. And inside they're thinking, we don't want to invade, we don't want to invade, because they knew what was going to happen. It was going to be a catastrophe for them. And then when it was clear that Hezbollah wouldn't stop firing the rockets, Israel had only two options: to invade or as it did to beg the United States to put through in the Security Council a ceasefire resolution. So Israel was, quote unquote, forced to end its attack on Lebanon. And the same thing is true today. If Hezbollah keeps up the attacks on northern Israel and targets as far as Tel Aviv, then Netanyahu will not be able to declare victory. And as a consequence, the pressure is going to build on him. He's got to invade. He's got to launch the invasion. And then he'll have a choice. Have the United States come in, save his scalp by imposing a ceasefire resolution or invading. What they did in 2006 was they got their ceasefire, they imposed a ceasefire resolution via Condoleezza Rice, and then they technically invaded, which is they sent in their troops all the way to the Litani so they can claim victory, and then the troops withdrew because there was a ceasefire. So as of now, based on what Mouin said, as of now, I believe that they're going to continue on the strategy of denying Netanyahu the ability to declare a victory and then forcing on him the decision of either asking the US to bail him out with a ceasefire resolution or carrying out the ground invasion. As to the bigger picture, where I feel more confident, the two obvious analogies are 1967 and the Gulf invasion of 2003. Netanyahu wants to pull off a 1967. We have to remember that 1967 sounded the death knell of what was called back then radical Arab nationalism. It inflicted it had inflicted a, I don't want to say devastating, it had inflicted a major defeat on Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, and that was the end of radical Arab nationalism. Now he's hoping what replaced the radical Arab nationalism, it looked like Israel won, everything was over. What replaced it, of course, was radical Islamic fundamentalism with the Iranian Revolution in 1979. And since 1979, they've had to deal with this new problem. Now it's crystallized in the axis of resistance, and they're hoping to do to the axis of resistance what it did in 1967. So he can, be the second great Israeli victory up to 67, and Mr. Netanyahu can take credit for it. And the other obvious analogy is 2003, where after 9/11, the United States was figuring out what it can get from 9/11. What can it squeeze out of 9/11? And it was scanning the maps, trying to figure out which country to bomb. Literally, if you read the accounts, they finally decided Afghanistan. When it came to Iraq, there was actually a split between the US and Israel because Israel wanted Iran first. Israel didn't very much care about Iraq. The US wanted Iraq first. And then the assumption was Afghanistan, Iraq, and then Iran. That didn't happen, obviously, because mission accomplished turned into mission disaster. And now they're doing the same thing, Israel, Gaza, Hezbollah, Iran. That's the sequence. Those are the dominoes. And they seem to believe that they can pull it off.
I want to pick up one point from what Mouin and Norm actually spoke about, and Mouin can respond, and also you can respond to what Norm just said. I wanted you to declutter a little bit about the objective of this escalation, and I think there are two things that are being talked about now. One, as you said, is delinking the resistance in Gaza from the support that Hezbollah offers by firing the rockets. And the other is a sort of internal war of narrative where Netanyahu's own image has been under question since the failure of security during October 7. And these are often discussed in media as two objectives. So can you comment on these two objectives and whatever you would like to comment on what Norm just said?
Well, first of all, on Netanyahu's, let's say, personal agenda, if I can put it that way. And again, I think his personal agenda is only part of a much broader picture. Many people have noted that Netanyahu, with this talk of total victory and so on, clearly has a Churchill complex. But yesterday I was reading an interview in the Israeli newspaper Haaretz with former senior Israeli military officer and government official Giora Eiland, who may be known to you because he is the one who has consistently been advocating mass starvation in the Gaza Strip and creating conditions to produce epidemic disease and so on. He made one point which I thought is worth considering, and he said the issue with Netanyahu is not a Churchill complex, but an FDR complex, in the sense that FDR was in charge of the U.S. ship of state on the 7th of December, 1941, Pearl Harbor. But he is remembered not for his failures at Pearl Harbor, but rather for leading the United States to the brink of victory during the Second World War, shortly before he died. And that, in Eiland's view, Netanyahu is determined to prolong this war and to seek to achieve a meaningful, if not decisive victory, so that at the end of the day, when the history books are written, and more importantly, when the commissions of inquiry and so on are put into place, that Netanyahu can offset his historic failure on the 7th of October, 2023, with whatever achievements he's now trying to achieve. Now, that's the personal agenda. I think in the broader picture, many people have noted that Israel has failed to develop a strategy, in the sense that its response to the 7th of October has been a maniacal genocidal campaign against the Gaza Strip to make it unfit for human habitation, just sowing death and destruction on a massive scale, but motivated primarily by revenge and bloodlust, uninformed by a persuasive political vision over what Israel hopes to achieve. I think that is no longer the case. I think Israel now has developed a much clearer strategy, particularly in the last month or two, where it now has a clear political objective of dismantling the axis of resistance, of, as we were saying earlier, delinking Lebanon and also Yemen and others from the Gaza Strip, and taking apart this coalition piece by piece, in order to have a decisive turning point in the history of the region, much like 1967, as Norm was just pointing out. So I think the real question is, are we now heading towards another 1967 or another 2003? And on the evidence, we have Israeli failure in the Gaza Strip. In Lebanon, I don't think there are many people who expect that Hezbollah and its capabilities have been sufficiently weakened to an extent that Israel can decisively defeat it, because I think another problem for Israel is its military is a very effective killing machine, but not particularly, it's quite mediocre when it comes to the actual fighting capabilities, particularly of its infantry and ground operations in urban combat. So ultimately, I think the issue is that the US is now fully on board with the Israeli agenda. It's probably fair to say that for much of the past year, the US was willingly endorsing and supplying and enabling everything Israel was doing, even if it was not always convinced by what Israel was doing. It just chose to support rather than oppose it. But I think we've now reached a juncture where the US is fully on board with the Israeli agenda, because the one red line for the United States is there can be no defeat of Israel. Israel cannot, if it's not going to succeed, it cannot be defeated. And particularly with this U.S. administration, which even by comparison with its predecessors has taken its unconditional support and participation in Israel's agenda to unprecedented heights. I think this puts us in a situation where between now and January 2025, when Biden leaves the White House, puts not only the region, but arguably the world in an extremely, extremely dangerous place.
Norm, can you comment on the consistent U.S. support for Israel? Vice President Kamala Harris and Joe Biden called the killing or assassination of Syed Hassan Nasrallah as a measure of justice, while at the same breath they talk about de-escalation in the region. What does it mean, and what do you see as the U.S. response going forward?
Oh, I want to first address what Mouin said, and then I'll move on to the U.S. I do believe that Israel had a clear objective after October 7th. And the clear objective was to once and for all put an end to the Gaza question. We're not going, what they called this war of attrition. They said, they're mowings of the lawn. They said that the next war, and this was said in 2015, the next war, they were tired of the wars of attrition. The next war would be the last war. And so the objective, in my opinion, was clear. The question was, what strategy? And the strategy had basically three possibilities. One, to expel the population. Two, to make Gaza uninhabitable. Or three, to an outright genocide.
Or all of the above.
Well, three wasn't an outright genocide in the sense of, as the Minister of Antiquities put it, to nuke Gaza. That was not a possibility because of PR. I know that's crude, but that's actually the fact. The expulsion, at least again, en masse, was not a possibility because President Sisi in Egypt, apparently acquiesced to by the United States, said no. And so the middle option was the main option, though, as Mouin said, they overlap. It's not as if they're discrete options and one precludes the other. They overlap. And they chose the middle option. They were forced into the middle option. And here there's some disagreement between Mouin and I think they succeeded. I think Gaza is and will, for the foreseeable future, certainly the next 10 to 15 years, it will be uninhabitable. We have to remember that as of October 6th, Gaza had not yet even rebuilt from 2006. From 2014. Gaza, I think it was, I can't remember if it was 75% or 90%, somewhere between there. It had rebuilt from 2016. So they hadn't even cleared away the rubble and replaced 2016 Operation, my memory.
2014.
2014. I'm very tired. They hadn't even replaced the destruction from 2014. And in 2014, there were 2.5 million tons of rubble. This time, as of now, the estimate is 45 million tons of rubble. So I think they have achieved that goal of solving the Gaza question. Now, Israel is a creature, I guess most countries are, they're creatures of opportunity. And a new opportunity opened up when Hezbollah started to fire in northern Israel. And the opportunity was, we can maybe use this occasion to also solve the Hezbollah question. It's probable that had Hezbollah not fired in northern Israel, they wouldn't have used this occasion to try to solve the Hezbollah question. But once that began, they began to patiently figure out a strategy. And it seems they had in their desk drawer the prerequisites, namely, they can target and knock out significant members of the Hezbollah leadership, up to and including the general secretary. I myself, I won't go into it. I believe they always could have knocked out the general secretary, Mr. Nasrallah, but they chose not to for fear of the retaliatory repercussions. I think this time, yes, its intelligence paid off for sure, but it has to also be remembered that Nasrallah didn't have to be in the Dahya, and the Dahya was the most suicidal place to be since Israel had already been attacking it, and it's replete with infiltrators, agents of the Israelis and the Americans, and also the Lebanese. He could have gone to one of the mountain redoubts. I've been to them. They have headquarters. Their real command and control was obviously not the Dahya. It was in these tunnels built deep inside mountains, which at the time, now I can't say, I don't know anything about the military, they said could withstand an atomic bomb. It was quite deep in the ground. He could have gone there. And that's what surprised me when I first heard the reports. I said, no, that's not possible. He would be buried in the mountain. He would be here high. And then it occurred, of course, he didn't want to die a coward. And if all of his comrades were killed, he wasn't about to survive by burying himself deep inside the mountain. So I think its intelligence capabilities, yes, they're very good, stupid to dispute it, but there was a certain amount of confluence of interest between Israel taking out Mr. Nasrallah and Mr. Nasrallah unwilling to die like a coward. But now there was the prospect of taking out Hezbollah, and if you can sufficiently provoke Iran or force Iran to retaliate, so you attack Gaza, you attack Hezbollah, you attack Syria, you attack Yemen, it makes it impossible for Iran not to do anything. They've got to react. And so the expectation was that we can knock them all out. So I think the original objective was there. It was pretty much limited to Gaza. Once Hezbollah entered the picture, the objective increased to also using this opportunity to take out Hezbollah. Nasrallah understood that, but he was in an impossible dilemma. The impossible dilemma was, if he did nothing while there was a genocide unfolding in Gaza, it would completely discredit Hezbollah. But he also knew they weren't ready for that confrontation with Israel, so they couldn't go in, so to speak, big. So he tried to carve out a middle course, the occasional bombing of northern Israel, the disruption of life in northern Israel. It didn't work. There was no middle course. I didn't believe, and I said it at the time, that Israel would ever accept Hezbollah's projectile attacks in northern Israel and would react. So I think that one has to look at it at three levels. I think there was an objective. I think that the strategy eventually crystallized on that middle option of making Gaza uninhabitable. And then there was the escalating strategy as new opportunities opened up, in particular, now having grounds for dismantling Hezbollah. As for the United States, yeah, please.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, just on the
No,
United
maybe
States.
maybe Mouin can just respond to this, and then we can come to the US question.
I just want to make one point because Norm put forward the suggestion that Israel has, in fact, for a quite long time, had the capability to assassinate Hassan Nasrallah, but chose not to do so out of fear for the repercussions. Whether that's in fact the case or not, I don't know. It may well be. But what I think is also important to note is that it wouldn't have been an exclusively Israeli decision to go forward with such an assassination. I think if it was indeed the case that Israel had previous opportunities, it was not only an Israeli fear of the repercussions that prevented it from doing so, but also an American veto. There's some evidence that the Americans have in the past warned Israel off such a course because they were concerned not only about the response to Israel, but also the response to the U.S. position in the Middle East, because I think the Americans concluded quite rightly that any such action would be seen as a joint U.S. Israeli attack.
What does
And just one more point, since we are talking about a potential Iranian response, it does appear that during this conversation, news reports are coming in that Iran has launched missiles at Israel.
I just wanted to follow up on what Mouin just said, and it sort of ties back well to my previous question on US. What Mouin just said is that there has been a long-standing veto on the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah. I was wondering what led to the breaking of that veto, or is it a case where you guys might think that this time Israel went ahead despite the veto of the U.S. This is very confusing because on one hand, as I said, Kamala Harris and Biden said this is a measure of justice, which is the killing of Nasrallah. But on the other hand, they are also talking about de-escalation.
Who's a question to?
Maybe Norm can respond and then Mouin can come back.
I want to just give my general understanding of the U.S. position. At the beginning, the U.S. Gave the green light for Israel to retaliate because Israel had, what was Israel supposed to do? We know the whole story. So it had the right to retaliate. The U.S. believed Israel had to restore its deterrence capacity, which basically means it has to show the Arab world that it's not weak. So the U.S. went along with that goal as well. There was the revenge goal the U.S. accepted, the retaliation goal, the need to restore its deterrence capacity. The U.S. went along with that. But the U.S. wasn't committed to the destruction of Gaza. It had no strategic interest in that. It's not as if Hamas was firing rockets at the United States. They didn't much care. They did care about Israel, as I said, restoring its deterrence capability. Because basically, the only reason the Arab states want this alliance with the United States and Israel is they want the U.S. and Israel to pull their chestnuts out of the fire in the event of a conflict with Iran. So Israel had to restore its deterrence capability so that Iran would see that so that Saudi Arabia could see that investment in the expansion of the Abraham Accords as being in its interest. If Israel is weak, then why have an accord with Israel? Israel is there to defend Saudi interests. But the third goal, the goal of solving the Gaza question, was not on the U.S. agenda. They don't much care because they're not really affected by it. Now, what happened was Israel seemed to be have a string of victories in the past year, and the United States now believes if Israel continues on a roll and the axis of resistance is destroyed, well, then the next obvious occurrence will be the expansion of the Abraham Accords to include the Saudis. So for the U.S., that would be the crowning victory. So at this point, it's supportive of the Israeli goal of neutering the so-called axis of resistance, and thereby paving the way to the Saudi joining of the Abraham Accords.
Mouin.
Could you repeat the question, because it was about the U.S. Support for?
Yes. You said that for a long time, the decision to not assassinate was a joint decision of the US and Israel. And I was wondering if this time the US withdrew its veto, or whether you think the Israelis went ahead despite what the Americans were thinking.
Yes, I think if it is indeed the case that Israel previously had the capability to assassinate Nasrallah, I think the reasons it didn't happen is first because Israel did not want to confront the repercussions of doing so, some of which I think we're learning today, and secondly, as with, for example, Israeli intentions to attack nuclear facilities in Iran, that such initiatives were vetoed by the U.S., including by the administration of George W. Bush and Obama, and I presume Trump as well. But I think what we have now in Washington is an administration that is uniquely devoted to the Israeli agenda, that has taken a position that it will not challenge any Israeli policy decision, even if Washington believes that that decision runs counter to or undermines U.S. interests. Biden has this policy of there can be no daylight between the United States and Israel, and is therefore committed to arming, to supplying, to providing diplomatic cover, to providing unconditional support for any and every Israeli policy, even where it is the White House's belief that that Israeli policy runs counter to the U.S. National interest. But I think it now goes even further than that, which is that Washington is not only providing, let's say, reluctant support. I think we can now make the case that Washington is fully on board with the U.S., with the Israeli agenda and Israeli objectives, and is committed to achieving them. That also explains, I think, why we've seen so many more deployments of U.S. forces to the Middle East, for example. Having said that, I also agree with pretty much everything Norman said in response to this question.
Muin has to go in maybe 10 minutes. So if I can ask one more question to Muin, and then Norm can stay back a little bit and we can reflect on that. Talking about the axis of resistance, there are reports now, Al Jazeera and others, which say that Iran is in a very difficult situation because on one hand there is a policy to open up to the West because of the vicious sanctions, which are very crippling for its economy, which we have seen in multiple cases: Venezuela, Cuba, North Korea, and so on. And on the other hand, the absolute lunacy that Israel is indulging in with full support of the US, because they are using the 2,000-pound bombs, but they're very rapidly depleting weapons, and stocks are constantly replenished by US war machine. What do you think is the Iranian is going to be the Iranian response in all of this?
Well, that Iranian response is playing out as we speak, with press reports of over 100 ballistic missiles fired from Iran towards Israel. And I think the context is interesting. It's quite clear that Iran has been extremely reluctant to engage Israel directly. And no small part because, unlike, let's say, some of these movements, it is much, as a state and as a regime, it is much more exposed. It has very vulnerable civilian infrastructure, oil facilities, and so on. And the only time that Iran has responded was when it was attacked directly, or at least its facilities in Damascus were directly targeted by Israel in April of this year. I think Iran sees itself and is seen by its coalition partners in the axis of resistance as kind of the strategic reserve of that coalition. In other words, it supplies weapons, technology, logistical support, and all the rest of it, but does not conduct all the fighting itself. And the point I think Norm has been making, which has now, I think, been validated, is that Israel has set on a strategy of repeatedly provoking and provoking and provoking its adversary until that adversary is left with no choice but to respond directly, thereby furnishing the pretext for a direct military confrontation. In light of developments in Lebanon in the past week, I think Iran had a dilemma. It could either respond directly and risk a general war in the Middle East, which it clearly does not want, or it could claim that it had full confidence in Hezbollah's ability to defend itself and defend Lebanon and stay on the sidelines, and then risk a considerable loss of credibility. I think what's happened is that Iran has taken a third option, and it's one that many people felt Hezbollah should have adopted as well, which is to recognize that at the end of the day, Israel will stop at nothing to ensure that there is going to be a direct military confrontation, and that it would therefore be in its interest to get ahead of the curve, so to speak, and launch this confrontation at a time of its own choosing, rather than at a time of Israel's choosing. I suspect that that is the Iranian calculation we're looking at present.
I want to just say, I know Mouin has to leave. I just wanted to say, look, Nasrallah was a very smart guy. And I will say honestly, I feel the loss. I literally feel the loss of his death. It feels like the world is an emptier place or more vacant place in his absence. He was a very smart guy, and he was also a very informative guy. He's the only leader in the world, literally. He was the only leader in the world, literally, where you could actually learn from his speeches. It was clear he did not have speechwriters. Now, name me another, no, ask yourself, name me another head of state. All right, Castro didn't have speechwriters, obviously.
Trump?
But he doesn't deliver speeches. Nasrallah and Chavez obviously didn't have speechwriters, because if it were Chavez and Castro, the speechwriters would be working for nonstop 24/7, because they didn't shut up. You know, once, just a funny story, when Chavez was trying to defend, what was his name? The head of state of Iran.
Ahmadinejad.
Ahmadinejad. Chomsky privately, in frustration, said, "Why can't he just shut up?" He was so frustrated with Chavez for making the situation even worse by coming out to supporting Ahmadinejad. In any event, to get back on point, so Nasrallah was a very smart guy. You learned from his speeches. His speeches were deeply insightful, even though the speeches had a double edge, because he's obviously also playing a psychological war with Israel. So there was a certain amount of boasting and a certain amount of ambiguity. But in general, so what I quote unquote figured out, I am quite certain he figured out light years ahead of me. The question was, what options did he have? If he let Israel commit its genocide in Gaza, he's completely discredited. If he goes too far, it will bring on a reaction which, quote unquote, the axis of resistance wasn't ready for. They knew that. The most important thing in Nasrallah's last speech was his very frank admission. He said they have the technological edge, and that means now is not the right time. So he tried, as I said, to carve out a middle course, but it wasn't available. There was no middle course. I remember when people were saying to me, I don't think Iran should retaliate, because if it retaliates, it's going to create a horror story. And I said, I wish Iran had a choice. And that's when I wrote the article, Samson and Cassandra, that if you look at the Israeli logic in 1967, the Israeli logic in 1982, the Israeli logic in 2008 with Operation Cast Lead, if you look at the logic, they won't stop. They will keep provoking and provoking and provoking until it evokes a reaction. And now Iran knows that. And the question is, what do you do with it? And there isn't, unfortunately, in the real world, there may not be any good choices. So I don't believe that I figured out something that Nasrallah didn't figure out a long time ago. He was the head of Hezbollah for 32 years. And I would say that's not easily replaceable. The most fundamental, you have to have a fine mind to be a political leader, a real political leader, not Kamala Harris or Donald Trump. But the other quality you need is the wisdom of life experience. That's what Professor Chomsky had. He started politics when he was 9 years old, analyzing the Spanish Civil War. And then he accumulated more knowledge, more experience, more knowledge, more experience. And when you have that knowledge and experience, it could sometimes be deceptive because history doesn't repeat itself. But on the other hand, you can learn a lot from analyzing and having experienced the record that preceded you. And so, even as I'm fully confident that there are many competent Arabs, competent Muslims who possess a real technical knowledge, I do think that Nasrallah's loss is significant because they don't have the life experience, those 32 years of analyzing and assimilating and plotting a course. And that's not replaceable in my view. Just as I don't believe in a completely separate, no, I don't believe Professor Chomsky is replaceable. I think his passing will leave a huge void between him and the next person. There is a chasm compounded by an abyss, really. And I believe the same thing with Nasrallah.
Muin, I give
the key question is did the movement under his leadership sufficiently construct and develop institutions and an institutional structure so that it can continue to act towards the same objectives or not. And I think that's a question that is very difficult for anyone to answer in this particular moment. And I think the next weeks and months will demonstrate whether he met the ultimate task of leadership, which is to allow the institution he led to continue and to grow in his absence, or whether he placed such a personal imprint on that organization that it cannot survive, or at least cannot remain effective once you remove that particular leader from the movement.
I would say in answer to that question, the historical record is not good. Lenin was succeeded by Stalin. Mandela was succeeded by Jacob Zuma. Chavez was succeeded by Maduro. In each case, the gap between the leader and the successor was huge to the point of a void. So if I were to look at the historical experience, and I can go through it, the second in line, for reasons which perplex me to some extent, second in line have always been very mediocre. The only exception I can think of was Vietnam, where after Ho Chi Minh's death, they actually did develop a collective leadership. If you remember, after Ho Chi Minh, there was no Vietnamese leader. They developed a collective leadership which was able to rise to the occasion and manage the task. China was a complete disaster. Mao didn't think too much about the future after him. So that was also Mao was a catastrophe. So in general, I would say that the historical record is not good on that score. On the other hand, Nasrallah had a deep belief in continuing the struggle, and so maybe, hopefully, he cultivated a next line that was more competent than in other cases.
All right. I think Muin has to leave. And
Yes.
thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have 2 requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.
I wanted to switch to the US election and we had an exchange, and I asked you about whether you have been thinking anything about the U.S. election. I am thinking about it from a left perspective, which it seems to me as an outsider that after the Sanders movement ended in sort of a catastrophe in 2020, there has been no left alternative, and the big debates in US politics became vax, anti-vax, and Trump versus Biden, Republican Party versus Democratic Party. And you said you have been thinking about Harris. There seems like a big rejuvenation of the Democratic Party campaign, at least from the donor class after Biden's unceremonious exit. Can you share your thoughts about Harris and what you have been thinking about US politics in general?
Well, there's nothing to think about, Harris. There's just nothing there. She's a laughing cow. I don't know why she's always laughing. The world's on fire. Why are you always laughing? She's just completely detached from reality. The Democratic Party, it engaged in this public relations juggernaut, this orchestration. It was very much, and I don't mean this facetiously, it was very much like the passing of the baton from Kim Il-sung to his son. This total non-entity, Kim Il-sung's son, he's suddenly the great leader. And we should all be joyful at the great leader. Kamala Harris is not even a 0, she's a -1. And it wasn't so much by the Democratic Party, it wasn't so much jubilation, because they knew that. If you remember, for the past 4 years, everybody was ridiculing Kamala Harris. They said she didn't get along with her staff, she wasn't, it was, and then all of a sudden they pulled this Kim Il-sung on us, and we're supposed to all be jubilant at the great leader. It wasn't so much jubilation at Harris, it was jubilation at no longer having the Biden albatross. At least Harris was, lucid. No content, but it was lucid and contentless, as against not lucid and contentless. And if you look at the campaign is just a negative campaign. Nobody much cares what her platform. She has no platform. I'm going to give money to people, small middle-class homeowners. Nobody's paying attention. The whole campaign is negative, that a vote for Harris is a vote for democracy. A vote for Trump is a vote for authoritarianism. Nobody's discussing what Trump's policies are. There's no discussion whatsoever. The question is, where will the American people come down? I remain a complete outlier. I think Trump's going to win. I said that after the convention, where it seemed like she was taking off, because she starts out basically losing two significant constituencies. Number one, the white working class. She's not going to get the white working class. That to me is pretty obvious, just from talking to people in the street. And number two, she's not going to get the under 30 vote. Now, they're not going to vote for Trump. No possibility. They'll sit it out. They will sit it out. So you lose those two constituencies, I think that's a real problem. Of course, she'll lose also the Arab Muslim constituency, but that's not a main one. It's just, and Kamala Harris will get the black woman vote, which anyone would have gotten, because that was a signature. That was a signature of the Biden administration, if you recall. This is very frustrating. If you recall, the Biden administration, it promised to appoint the first black woman Supreme Court justice. which he did with Ketanji Brown Jackson. He then had a Black woman, lesbian press secretary. He then, there was a third appointment with Ketanji Brown Jackson, his press secretary. And Kamala Harris. So he wrapped up the Black woman vote, and she'll get that. Hispanic vote seems in nobody's pocket right now. So I'm skeptical because I have conversations with ordinary people. I'm not relying on the pollsters, and even though Alan Lichtman seems to have this perfect record of predicting presidents, and he now says that Harris will win, I still don't see it. I think that there's too much dissatisfaction out there with the economic situation for Harris to succeed. And she's not really running on an economic platform. They're just running. What was the editorial yesterday in the Times? Do you have the Times in front of you?
Yes.
I know you guys multitask. I don't do that.
Right.
What was the headline yesterday? The editorial board's endorsement for Kamala Harris.
Let me check.
Just the New York Times editorial support Kamala Harris.
Here you go. The only patriotic choice for president.
Yeah, it's just about supporting democracy. It's patriotic. Not that she offers anything.
Mm-hmm.
Not that anyone would believe she offers anything. That's just, she's not, there's no, Biden had a track record, whether you liked it or not, he had a track record. She has no track record. It's an interesting thing, Professor Chomsky, he said the Republican Party is the most dangerous institution in human history. And there's obviously truth to that. I am a great believer in the credo, don't quarrel with facts. And you can make an argument for that. But the fact that I don't want to say but, I wouldn't dare say anything about Professor Chomsky, but I'll just say, in addition, it has to be borne in mind that the Republican Party, at least they had a primary. A primary is kind of the bedrock of bourgeois democracy, the primary. We all remember the candidates. There was sitting on stage, Vivek Ramaswamy, there was Nikki Haley, there was Chris Christie, there was Ron DeSantis. It was actually an impressive lineup. Some of them are quite smart. The Democratic Party suspended the primary. There was no primary in the Democratic Party. The bedrock, that's the bedrock of a bourgeois democracy. They just, Biden declared his successor, and the powers that be, which were basically Schumer, Pelosi, and Obama, and then the powers that be, at the beginning, they were not pleased with that. As you remember, Schumer said he went on board for a primary at the convention, that there would be a sorting out between candidates. Obama didn't endorse Harris until he was the last. And Pelosi was not for it. But it turned out to just be an appointment. There was no primary, there was nothing. I mean, Kamala Harris didn't get a single vote, a single delegate after she ran for president in 2020, not one. She came in fourth, I think, in her own state of California in the primary. So at the minimum, the basic standards of democracy, I would have to conclude the Republican Party is a more Democratic Party than the Democratic Party.
Do you think
the Democratic Party was just a coronation?
I've often wondered about, your admiration for Professor Chomsky and what you would have thought about his unwavering stance that at the end the Republican Party is worse than the Democratic Party. I mean, he always warned us to not think of politics in terms of presidential elections, but at that last instance he maintained until 2020. I wonder what you think he might have thought this time if he was active enough to share his thoughts.
There's no question what he would think. Professor Chomsky was, if nothing else, he was consistent. There were very few, I'm trying to think in all the time that I knew him, were there any occasions where I was genuinely surprised by a stance that he took? There are some, let's see, I'll give you a few examples. Now, I've never revealed this, and I don't think I'm doing any, I have to be careful because I have to respect him. And I have to be careful because people say things privately, often off the cuff, and then they think them through much more carefully before they say it publicly. I say very wild things privately. So, but there were occasions where, let's just say, I was surprised by his opinions. And I'm not going to quote any of them.
Maybe you should give us some headline moments so that we can grow from 40,000 to 400,000 or maybe 4 million.
No, because he's not.
I was just joking.
He's not in a position to elaborate on his opinions, and they were often private conversation, which, as I say, it's not as developed. So no, it's clear where he would have stood. Where I disagreed with him was he always said, you're just going into the voting booth for 1 minute, just vote for the person who's going to have do less harm, and then go on with the business of organizing to try to make the world a better place. He didn't consider it a weighty or cosmic significance. You just go in. We know Harris is going to do less harm than Trump, and then let's move on. Okay? I felt that approach was not fully cognizant or didn't take fully into account all sorts of other, what you might call secondary or derivative factors. So let's, instead of talking in highfalutin language, let's be concrete. So in 2016, of course, Professor Chomsky says, vote for Biden, not Trump. No, vote for Hillary, not Trump. Vote for Hillary,
16.
not Trump. 2016, yeah. Vote for Hillary, not Trump. Well, Trump wins, okay? Now, what happens? If Hillary had won, there's no question that the Democratic Party would have supported her in 2020. There's also no question that Bernie Sanders would not have defied the Democratic Party. And so the fact of the matter is, and I think it is a fact, I don't think it's open to dispute, had Hillary won, there would not have been the most significant mass movement in modern American history, the Bernie Sanders candidacy. It would not have happened. Now, you could say that couldn't be predicted and so on and so forth. But we have to say in retrospect, it was not so simple to just vote for Hillary, because it would have precluded, and I would put that word in emphasis. I'm not talking about a possibility. It would have precluded the Bernie Sanders candidacy. Secondly, the tendency is when Democrats come into power, they neutralize opposition, give them a chance, they have no choice, the whole blah, blah, blah. Whereas when a Trump gets into power, nobody defers to this, give him a chance, and he's doing the best that he could. We don't say that when a Trump is in power. So the prospects and possibilities for real opposition, they significantly increase when there is a Trump-type figure in power.
Can I interrupt you there?
I want to just say one last thing, then you'll be free to interrupt me, though I'm going to have to leave too. The last thing is, of course, analogies are always, as I said earlier, history doesn't repeat itself. So one has to be careful about analogies. But Trump is not a fascist-like figure for a very simple reason. The ruling elite doesn't need fascism. Fascism emerged at a point in history where there were two formidable forces. There were the forces of capitalism and the forces of socialism, the working class movement. It seemed to have real prospects between the Communist and Socialist Party had they found a common ground in Germany. And there was a formidable Italian Communist Party and Socialist Party, of which Mussolini was once part. If the system, if it was really in jeopardy, then the institutions of quote unquote bourgeois democracy would defer to Trump were he to try to carry out an authoritarian coup. If they had to choose between a Trump authoritarian coup and a anti-capitalist, we won't call it leftist or socialist, and an anti-capitalist movement, yes, I believe there would be a danger. But what do we have now? There is no left. There's no threat to bourgeois democracy. There's no threat to capitalism. So were Trump to try to carry out a coup, let's ask ourselves a simple question. Justice Roberts, Justice Gorsuch, Justice Alito, would they go along with it? I don't think there's any possibility the Supreme Court would go along with it. They like the system. The system is pro-business. Roberts is pro-business. Gorsuch is pro-business. They like the system. The system is just fine. Why would they want to dismantle all the institutions of bourgeois democracy, all of its protocols and its checks and balances, and give the power over to Trump? I don't think there's any possibility. Would the military go along with it? No. A lot of them are very patriotic to our institutions. As you remember, when Trump tried in 2020, even Pence wouldn't go along with it. Even his vice president wouldn't go along with it. So I think this talk about him presenting a threat to democracy, I don't see it. I think the institutions of bourgeois democracy are quite robust. They have a long history, and it's not as if the people who staff those institutions are about to jettison them for Donald Trump. This is really ridiculous. It's getting on my nerves.
Is that an alarm or something?
No, it's people calling, but
Oh.
so I should have disconnected the phone. So I don't believe that the threats that are claimed are valid. I think that's scaremongering.
It was interesting to me that I think Professor Chomsky would agree with you on your analysis of whether Trump represents fascism. Even he used to say that he's not the classical fascist type, and he would also agree with you that there is no such danger to the business class at this moment. But I was thinking about once someone asked him about this Zizekian line, which you just said today, that if Hillary had come to power, we wouldn't have had the Sanders movement. And Zizek made this same argument that Donald Trump would come and shake the system, out of which we might have some radical movement. And this question was put forth to Professor Chomsky, and his response was that this is a very stupid idea, because, I mean, he gave the reference of Hitler again, but I think he could come back and say, yeah.
That was the slogan of the Communist Party during what was called the Third Period.
Mm-hmm.
Said after fascism, socialism.
Right.
Well, unfortunately, after fascism, there was more fascism, and then there were about 60 million people who died in World War II. And even then, you didn't get socialism.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's the classic left argument. Not an argument, it's a slogan. The worse it gets, the better. No, I don't believe that. I don't think the worse it gets, it's better. But I do believe that there would have been there was more room to organize an opposition during the Trump period than there would have been under the Clinton period. I mean, remember, we wouldn't be electing Harris for 4 years, we'd be electing her for 8 years. There's no way the Democrat is going to say, all right, let's have a primary in the next election cycle. It's not going to happen.